The BBQ Pitstop sat just off the main highway, a blink and you'll miss it kind of place. Its sign flickered weakly in the twilight, and the gravel parking lot was uneven, dotted with potholes that filled up whenever it rained. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting smells of smoked ribs, sizzling sausages, and sweet tangy barbecue sauce. The decor wasn't much: old license plates nailed to the walls, a few faded photos of smiling patrons, and neon beer signs buzzing faintly in the corners. The tables and chairs didn't match, each piece telling its own story of years of wear. For Emily Dawson, this quiet, unassuming place was a welcome stop on her long drive. She didn't need anything fancy, she preferred places like this. There was something calming about the simplicity, the way everyone just minded their own business. It reminded her of the old diners she used to visit as a kid, before life got complicated. She sat at a corner table, sipping her iced tea slowly. It wasn't much, a little watery, with too much ice, but it was cold, and that was all she cared about. Her plate was mostly empty, save for a few crumbs of cornbread and a sliver of brisket she was saving for the last bite. She wasn't in a rush. This was her moment to unwind, away from the relentless miles of highway that stretched behind her and the ones waiting ahead. Emily kept her head down, her hood up, blending into the background. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor made it easy for people to overlook her, which suited her just fine. She didn't need attention. She'd had enough of that in another life, a life she rarely talked about. To anyone watching, she was just another traveler passing through, probably on her way to somewhere more interesting. But Emily wasn't on her way to anywhere. Not really. She was taking the long way to nowhere in particular, stopping wherever the road took her, looking for something she couldn't quite name. She traced the rim of her glass with her finger, lost in thought, when the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that rattled the nearest window. The room seemed to hold its breath. 6 men strode in, their heavy boots stomping on the wooden floor like thunder. They were big, loud, and brash, wearing dusty leather jackets with patches of skulls and flames sewn onto the sleeves. Their presence sucked the air out of the room, and every pair of eyes turned to watch them. Emily didn't look up. She didn't need to. She'd heard the kind of people who walked like that, talked like that, 1,000 times before. Bullies who thought they owned every space they stepped into. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a grizzled beard and a crooked grin, surveyed the room like a king inspecting his kingdom. His name was Mitch, though he never introduced himself. He didn't need to. People like him expected everyone to know who they were, to recognize their swagger and their reputation. Mitch's gaze landed on Emily, sitting alone in her corner, her hood casting a shadow over her face. "Well, look what we've got here," he muttered, loud enough for his crew to hear. "Alone, dear, out in the open." His words were followed by a ripple of laughter from his friends, who spread out around the room like a pack of wolves. One of them adjusted his belt, the metal buckle gleaming under the dim light. Another ran a hand through his greasy hair, smirking as his eyes darted from table to table. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't even glance their way. Instead, she picked up her glass and took another sip, her movements calm and deliberate. Mitch's grin widened. He wasn't used to being ignored. Most people, when they saw him and his crew, either got out of their way or went out of their way to be friendly. But this woman, this small, quiet woman in a hoodie, acted like they weren't even there. Mitch leaned down to whisper something to one of his buddies, and the man snorted with laughter. The rest of the group followed suit, their voices loud and obnoxious, filling the once peaceful room with crude jokes and exaggerated guffaws. Emily remained still, her expression unchanged. She'd been in more tense situations than this, though the men surrounding her couldn't possibly know that. To them, she was just another passerby, a small-framed woman who looked like she wouldn't hurt a fly. Across the room, the waitress behind the counter shifted nervously. She was young, probably in her early 20s, and the way her hands trembled as she poured a beer said this wasn't the first time she'd dealt with men like Mitch and his crew. The cook in the kitchen peeked through the small window in the swinging door, his face tight with worry. It didn't take long for Mitch to make his next move. He sauntered over to Emily's table, his boots scuffing the floor with every step. His friends watched eagerly, nudging each other and exchanging smirks. Mitch stopped a few feet away, looming over her like a storm cloud. "You here all by yourself, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Emily slowly set her glass down. She didn't look at him, didn't respond. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until one of the men at the other table called out, "Hey, Mitch, maybe she doesn't speak English." The group erupted into laughter, the sound grating against the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant. Mitch chuckled, but there was an edge to it. He didn't like being ignored. "I'm talking to you," he said, louder this time, his tone turning sharper. He took a step closer, close enough that the faint smell of beer and sweat reached Emily's nose. She lifted her head then, just enough for her eyes to meet his. They were steady, calm, and unreadable like the surface of a deep, still lake. "I heard you," she said simply, her voice quiet but firm. Mitch blinked, taken aback for a moment. Then he laughed, shaking his head. "Well, that's more like it," he said, though the humor in his voice didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't need to be shy, darlin'. We're just being friendly." Emily didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her gaze held his for a beat longer before she looked away, reaching for her glass again. Mitch's grin faltered. Behind him, one of his buddies muttered, "Guess she's not impressed, huh?" The comment earned another round of laughter, but Mitch didn't join in this time. His jaw tightened, and his hand flexed at his side. Emily took another sip of her tea, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't need to do anything else. She'd seen Mitch's type before. Men like him didn't know what to do with silence. They thrived on reactions, on fear, or flattery, and when they didn't get it, they floundered. Still, Emily didn't underestimate him. Mitch might have been a bully, but he wasn't harmless. She could feel the tension radiating off him, the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. The room was dead silent now, the air thick with anticipation. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the shift, its usual skipping songs replaced by an eerie stillness. The waitress hovered near the counter, her eyes darting nervously between Emily and Mitch. The cook's shadow lingered in the kitchen window, his shoulders tense. Mitch leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You got a name, sweetheart?" Emily didn't look at him. She didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up her fork and resumed eating, as if he wasn't even there. The message was clear. And it only made Mitch angrier. The air in the barbecue joint seemed to grow heavier as Mitch leaned closer, his large frame casting a shadow over Emily's table. His buddies hollered encouragement from their seats, their laughter echoing through the room. "Come on, now," Mitch said, his voice low and drawling. "Don't be shy. We don't bite, much." The words were meant to be playful, but the threat beneath them was unmistakable. Emily didn't respond. Her calm demeanor was unshakable. She wasn't a stranger to people like Mitch, men who thought size and volume equaled power. If she'd learned anything over the years, it was how to recognize empty posturing. Her silence only seemed to stoke the fire in Mitch's chest. He straightened slightly, glancing back at his crew with a smirk, as if to say, "Watch this." He reached out, placing one meaty hand on the edge of Emily's table. The wood creaked under the weight. "You don't look like you belong in a place like this," he said, his tone shifting to something sharper, more insistent. "What's a girl like you doing all alone out here? You waiting for someone?" Emily finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were cool and unreadable, a stark contrast to the rising heat in Mitch's expression. "No, she said simply. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Mitch blinked, surprised by her bluntness. Behind him, his crew exchanged glances, their laughter fading into an awkward murmur. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down the side of his face, leaned forward from his seat. "Hey, Mitch," he called out, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe she's just playing hard to get." This earned a few snickers, but Mitch didn't join in. His eyes never left Emily's, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. There was something about the way she held his gaze unblinking, unafraid, that unnerved him. She wasn't intimidated, and that wasn't something Mitch was used to. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but deliberate. "Are we done here?" she asked, her tone neutral. The question hit like a slap. Mitch's grin faltered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back off. But then he straightened up, his bravado returning in full force. "Done," he repeated, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Sweetheart, we're just getting started." He pulled out the chair opposite Emily and dropped into it with a thud, leaning forward on the table. The wood groaned under his weight, but Emily didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in her lap, waiting. The waitress behind the counter took a shaky step forward, her eyes darting between Mitch and Emily. Sir," she said hesitantly, "maybe you should leave her alone. She's just trying to eat." Mitch turned his head slowly, fixing the waitress with a glare that froze her in place. "Mind your business," he snapped. "Or you'll be next." The waitress recoiled, her face pale, and retreated behind the counter. Emily's jaw tightened. That one sentence told her everything she needed to know about Mitch and his crew. They weren't just loudmouths, they thrived on fear, on making people feel small. "Is that how you talk to people?" Emily said quietly. Mitch turned back to her, his grin returning. "What's it to you?" Emily shrugged. "Just seems like a waste of energy." Her calmness was like a splash of cold water. Mitch leaned back, his grin twisting into something meaner. "You got a smart mouth for someone sittin' all alone," he said. "What are you, some kind of tough girl? Hiding under that hoodie like you're too good to talk to anyone?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any retort, and it was starting to get under Mitch's skin. Scarface spoke up again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hey, Mitch, maybe she's one of those undercover types. You know, FBI or something. This brought another round of laughter, but it was half-hearted. The tension in the room was growing, palpable enough to make even Mitch's crew uneasy. Emily's gaze flicked to Scarface, then back to Mitch. Her expression remained unchanged, but her posture shifted ever so slightly. She sat straighter, her shoulders square. Mitch noticed. His grin wavered. "You know," he said, leaning forward again, "you're lucky I'm in a good mood. Otherwise, I might not be so friendly." Emily's lips quirked upward, the faintest hint of a smile. "This is you being friendly?" The question landed like a punch. Mitch's grin vanished completely, replaced by a scowl. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think you're funny, huh?" he said. Emily didn't respond. She picked up her glass and took another sip, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The silence stretched again, heavier this time. The other patrons in the room barely dared to breathe. Mitch's fingers drummed against the table, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't used to being ignored, and he didn't like it. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. Emily set her glass down, her gaze steady. "So do you." The words were quiet, almost casual, but they carried a weight that made Mitch pause. For the first time, he hesitated. Behind him, one of his crew muttered something under his breath, and the others nodded in agreement. Even they could feel the shift in the air, the way the room seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Mitch glanced over his shoulder, then back at Emily. He was trying to read her, to figure out what it was about her that made him feel uneasy. "You're not from around here," he said, more as a statement than a question. Emily didn't answer. Mitch leaned forward, his scowl deepening. "What are you, then? Some kind of drifter? You think you're better than us?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I think I'm just trying to finish my meal." The simplicity of the statement caught Mitch off guard. He stared at her for a long moment, his mind working to find a way to regain control of the situation. Finally, he pushed his chair back with a loud scrape and stood, towering over her. "You think you're real tough, don't you?" he said. "Sit in there all quiet, actin' like you don't care." Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Do I seem tough to you?" Mitch opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He hesitated, his confidence faltering for just a second. It was enough. Emily's quiet strength, her unshakable composure, had thrown him off balance. He didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't afraid of him, who didn't react the way he expected. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then Mitch laughed, a harsh, forced sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," he said again, but this time the words sounded hollow. He turned to his crew. "Come on, let's get outta here. This place is a dump anyway." The other men hesitated, glancing at each other uncertainly, but one by one, they got up and followed Mitch toward the door. As they left, Mitch threw one last glance over his shoulder, his expression a mix of frustration and confusion. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes said he wasn't used to walking away. Emily watched them go, her expression calm. The waitress let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging in relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Emily gave a small nod, picking up her glass. "It's nothing," she said softly. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. Men like Mitch didn't let things go that easily. Mitch's friends hollered, clinking their beer bottles and cheering him on like rowdy spectators in a gladiator match. The air in the barbecue joint thickened with tension. Everyone seemed to be waiting for what would happen next. Emily, however, didn't seem fazed. She picked up her iced tea and took a deliberate sip, her gaze steady but distant, as if Mitch's theatrics were nothing more than background noise. This lack of reaction was like gasoline to Mitch's fire. His smirk turned into a full-blown sneer as he pulled out a chair from her table and sat down without asking. "You don't talk much, do you?" Mitch said, leaning forward and propping his elbows on the table. The table creaked under his weight, and the faint sound made a few patrons wince. "I get it, you're the strong, silent type. But here's the thing, I like to know who I'm dealing with." Emily's eyes met his briefly, her face still unreadable. She shifted slightly in her seat but said nothing. "That's right," Mitch continued, clearly emboldened by her silence. "You're not much, are you? Just another lost little bird looking for a safe perch. Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll make sure you're taken care of." The suggestion in his tone made Emily's fingers twitch slightly, though she kept them folded on the table. One of Mitch's crew, a wiry man with a toothpick dangling from his lips, called out from across the room, "Careful, Mitch. She might be tougher than she looks." The group erupted into laughter again, but Emily's steady gaze remained locked on Mitch. There was no fear in her eyes, no nervous flicker that he could latch onto. "You got a name, sweetheart?" Mitch pressed, leaning closer. "Emily," she said simply. "Emily," Mitch repeated, rolling the name around like it was some kind of joke. "That's cute. You got a last name, Emily?" She tilted her head slightly, as if debating whether or not to answer. Finally, she said, "Dawson." Mitch leaned back, feigning surprise. "Dawson, huh? Sounds official. You a teacher or something? Maybe a librarian?" He chuckled, looking back at his crew for approval. "What are you, some kind of bookworm out here in the wild?" Emily didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she gave a small shrug, her lips barely moving as she said, "Something like that." Mitch laughed, slapping the table hard enough to make the plates rattle. "I like you, Dawson. You've got spirit. But you're not very smart, sit in here all by yourself." The cook peeked out from the kitchen again, his expression grim. The waitress behind the counter busied herself stacking cups, but her hands shook with every movement. Everyone could see the storm brewing, but no one dared to step in. Emily, however, didn't seem concerned. "I'm just passing through," she said softly. Mitch leaned forward again, narrowing his eyes. "Passing through? That's so? Where you headed?" Emily paused, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Nowhere special." Mitch's grin turned predatory. "Well, maybe we can make your stop a little more memorable." At that, one of the older men sitting at the bar muttered under his breath, "Damn fool's about to bite off more than he can chew." The comment was soft, barely audible over the hum of the jukebox, but Mitch heard it. His head snapped around, his grin replaced by a scowl. "What's that, old man?" The older patron didn't look up, just swirled the beer in his mug. "Just sayin' you ought to leave her be. World's full of surprises, and some of 'em ain't pleasant." Mitch's buddies laughed, but their leader's face darkened. He stood up slowly, towering over Emily's table, and turned toward the bar. "You wanna run that by me again?" Mitch asked, his tone sharp. The older man shrugged, finally meeting Mitch's gaze. "Not really. Just figured you'd have better sense." Mitch took a step toward the bar, his fists clenching at his sides. The cook disappeared back into the kitchen, and the waitress froze in place, her eyes wide. Before Mitch could get any closer, Emily's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Leave him alone." It wasn't loud, but it was firm. Mitch stopped in his tracks, turning to face her again. "What'd you say?" he asked, his tone laced with incredulity. Emily stood up slowly, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape. Despite her smaller frame, there was something about the way she carried herself controlled, measured, and unshaken that made the room feel smaller. "You heard me," she said. "Leave him alone." The tension in the room skyrocketed. Mitch's buddies stopped laughing, their expressions turning serious. The patrons around them held their breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Mitch let out a bark of laughter, the sound harsh and grating. "You got guts, I'll give you that. But you're in way over your head, sweetheart." Emily took a small step forward, her posture relaxed but her eyes locked on Mitch's. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But I'm not the one making a scene." The remark landed like a slap, and Mitch's face twisted in anger. He took a step toward her, towering over her, his jaw tight. "You think you're smart, huh? Think you're gonna teach me a lesson?" Emily didn't flinch. "I don't have to." The simple statement threw him off, and for a moment, Mitch just stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The room was dead silent, save for the hum of the faulty jukebox. Then one of Mitch's buddies, Scarface, spoke up from the back. "Hey, Mitch, maybe she's one of those crazy martial arts types. You know, like in the movies." The joke drew a few nervous laughs, but Mitch didn't join in. He was too focused on Emily, trying to figure her out. "You hiding something under that hoodie?" he asked, his tone low and accusatory. Emily's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The response sent a ripple through the room. Mitch's crew exchanged uncertain glances, and even Mitch hesitated. There was something about her calmness, her unshakable poise, that was starting to make him second-guess himself. The older man at the bar let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Told ya, boy. World's full of surprises." Mitch shot him a glare but didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Emily, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You think you're real tough, don't you?" he said, his voice barely above a growl. Emily didn't answer. She just stood there, her gaze steady and unflinching. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Mitch seemed to wrestle with himself, torn between backing down and proving his dominance. Finally, he let out a frustrated grunt and took a step back. "You're not worth it," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. He turned to his crew, jerking his head toward the door. "Come on, let's get outta here. This place sucks anyway." The group hesitated, glancing between Mitch and Emily, but eventually, they followed their leader toward the exit. As the door slammed shut behind them, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The waitress let out a shaky breath, and the cook poked his head out from the kitchen, his expression one of relief. Emily sat back down, her movements calm and deliberate, as if nothing had happened. She picked up her iced tea and took another sip, her gaze drifting to the window. The older man at the bar raised his mug in her direction. "Well played, miss. Well played." Emily gave a small nod but didn't say anything. She knew Mitch wasn't done. Men like him never let things go that easily. For now, though, the room was quiet again. The jukebox stuttered through another song, and the smell of barbecue smoke filled the air. But outside, in the parking lot, Mitch was pacing next to his motorcycle, his face a mask of barely contained rage. His crew stood nearby, uneasy but silent, waiting for his next move. "This ain't over," Mitch muttered, his voice low and venomous. "Not by a long shot." Mitch paced in tight circles, boots crunching against the gravel of the parking lot. His hands clenched into fists, and his breathing was heavy and uneven. His crew stayed at a cautious distance, exchanging wary glances. Even Scarface, who usually enjoyed egging Mitch on, stayed quiet. "Who does she think she is?" Mitch muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Some little nobody, sitting there all smug like she owns the place." "Boss," Scarface finally spoke up, his voice hesitant, "maybe we should let it go. She didn't do anything. Just some girl passing through." Mitch spun on him, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Let it go? Let it go?" he repeated, his voice rising. "She made a fool out of me in front of everyone." Scarface took a step back, holding up his hands. "I'm just saying, man. She didn't exactly fight back. Maybe she ain't worth the trouble." Mitch's jaw tightened, his mind racing. It wasn't just about the girl anymore, it was about respect. He couldn't let someone, especially someone like her, embarrass him in front of his crew. "She's hiding something," Mitch growled, pointing toward the barbecue joint. "The way she looked at me, like she knew something I didn't. No, this ain't over." "Yeah, but," one of the others, a heavy-set man nicknamed Tank, spoke up cautiously. "What if she's, I dunno, connected or something? I mean, she was way too calm, boss. You think she's just some random chick?" Mitch snorted, his ego too bruised to entertain the possibility. "What could she be, huh? A secret agent? An assassin? Give me a break." Tank shrugged, clearly uneasy. "Stranger things have happened." "She's nobody," Mitch insisted, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. "And I'm gonna prove it." He marched toward his bike and swung a leg over, revving the engine loud enough to rattle the windows of the barbecue joint. The sound echoed across the lot, drawing the attention of a few patrons who peeked out nervously. Mitch's crew followed suit, their engines growling to life one by one. Inside, Emily didn't even glance toward the window. She calmly finished the last bite of her meal, then placed a few bills on the table. "You sure you're okay?" the waitress asked cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily gave her a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said softly. "But thank you." As she stood up, the older man at the bar watched her closely. "They're still out there," he warned, nodding toward the parking lot. "I know," Emily replied simply, slipping her hands into the pockets of her hoodie. "You need help?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Emily shook her head. "I'll be fine." Without another word, she walked toward the door, her movements unhurried and calm. She pushed it open and stepped outside, the warm night air wrapping around her like a blanket. The roar of motorcycles greeted her, and all 6 riders turned to face her as she stepped onto the gravel lot. Mitch smirked, his confidence seemingly restored now that they were on his turf. Well, he drawled, shutting off his engine and swinging off his bike. "Look who decided to come out and play." Emily stopped a few feet from the group, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "I told you, I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice steady. "And I told you," Mitch said, taking a step closer, "you don't get to decide that." The rest of the crew fanned out behind him, forming a loose semicircle around Emily. The tension was palpable, the air crackling with the unspoken threat of violence. "You think you're tough?" Mitch asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Think you can walk out here and stare me down like you're somebody?" Emily didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "What's the matter?" Mitch taunted. "Cat got your tongue." Scarface chuckled nervously. "Boss, maybe we—" "Shut up," Mitch snapped, cutting him off. His eyes never left Emily. "I want to hear her say it. Come on, sweetheart. You got something to prove." Emily took a slow, deliberate step forward. The gravel crunched under her foot, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. "You think this is about proving something?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with a quiet intensity. Mitch blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Yeah, I do," he said, though the conviction in his voice faltered. Emily took another step forward, now close enough that Mitch could see the faint scars on her knuckles. Her hands remained in her pockets, but there was something about her presence, a quiet, unshakable confidence that made even the bravest man think twice. "You're not looking for a fight," she said softly. "You're looking for control. That's why you can't stand it when someone doesn't give you what you want." Mitch bristled, his face flushing red. "You don't know a damn thing about me," he spat. "Maybe not," Emily said. "But I know enough." The crew shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. "Boss," Tank murmured, his voice low, "maybe we should just leave it." "She's—" "Shut up." Mitch barked, his voice echoing across the lot. "I don't need you telling me what to do." Emily tilted her head again, her gaze unflinching. "You don't want them to see you back down," she said, her voice quiet but cutting. "But deep down, you know you're making a mistake." Mitch's hands curled into fists, his teeth grinding audibly. "You think you're so smart," he growled. "Think you're better than me." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took one last step forward, now standing just inches from him. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "I think," she said, her tone icy and precise, "you should walk away while you still can." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Mitch's crew exchanged uneasy glances, the doubt in their eyes clear. Even Scarface, who rarely backed down from a fight, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. For a moment, It seemed like Mitch might listen. His gaze darted between Emily and his crew, his bravado cracking under the weight of her unwavering calm. But then his pride kicked in, and his face twisted into a snarl. "You don't tell me what to do," he hissed, lunging forward. What happened next was so fast that most of the crew didn't even see it. One moment Mitch was reaching for Emily, and the next he was on the ground, clutching his wrist and groaning in pain. Emily hadn't moved more than an inch, her stance still relaxed, her hands still in her pockets. It was as if she had disarmed him without even trying. The rest of the crew froze, their eyes wide with shock. "Holy, what just happened?" Scarface stammered, taking a step back. Emily's gaze swept over the group, her expression calm but unyielding. "I told you," she said evenly. "I don't want any trouble." Tank stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Hey, lady, we don't want trouble either. Mitch, man, let's just go." But Mitch wasn't ready to back down. He struggled to his feet, his face twisted in anger and humiliation. "You think you're tough," he spat, his voice shaking. "You got lucky, that's all." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, the first hint of real emotion flickering across her face. "You don't want to do this," she warned. Mitch lunged again, and this time, Emily moved. It was over in seconds. Mitch hit the ground hard, gasping for breath as Emily stood over him, her posture as calm and controlled as ever. The crew stared, their mouths hanging open in stunned silence. "Now," Emily said, her voice sharp and commanding, "get on your bikes and leave. Don't come back." For a moment, no one moved. Then Tank nodded quickly, grabbing his helmet and urging the others to follow. "Come on, guys," he said, his voice trembling. "Let's go." One by one, they climbed onto their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Mitch staggered to his feet, glaring at Emily with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. Emily didn't respond. She just watched as he climbed onto his bike and sped off, his crew following close behind. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the night, the barbecue joint erupted into murmurs and whispers. The older man at the bar let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head. Emily turned and walked back inside, her expression unreadable. The room fell silent as she passed, every eye watching her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She sat back down at her table, picked up her iced tea, and took another sip. The waitress approached cautiously, her hands still shaking. "Are you okay?" she asked. Emily looked up at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'm fine," she said simply. But as she sat there, her calm facade firmly in place, Emily knew one thing for certain: Mitch wasn't the type to let things go. This was far from over. The scrape of Emily's chair against the wooden floor was loud in the tense silence that followed. Every eye in the room turned to her, the weight of her presence making the air seem heavier. Mitch's crew paused mid-laughter, their smirks faltering as they glanced between her and their leader. Emily's voice cut through the room, low and deliberate. "Let her go." The biker holding the waitress froze, caught off guard by the calm authority in her tone. He blinked, then sneered, his grip tightening slightly. "Or what, little lady? You gonna stop me?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her movements measured and deliberate. The waitress looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, her lips trembling as she tried to pull away from the biker's grasp. "I said," Emily repeated, her tone firm but controlled, "let her go." Mitch leaned back in his chair, laughing harshly. "Oh, this just keeps getting better. The lone deer's got some fight in her, huh?" His crew joined in the laughter, emboldened by Mitch's mockery, but there was a hint of unease in their eyes. Something about Emily's demeanor, her unwavering calm, the way she seemed to be calculating every move was unsettling. The biker holding the waitress let out a bark of laughter, clearly trying to save face in front of his friends. "You got guts, I'll give you that," he said, releasing the waitress with a shove. She stumbled back, nearly dropping her tray, but Emily caught her by the arm and steadied her. "You okay?" Emily asked quietly, her voice softening for a moment. The waitress nodded quickly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered before retreating to the kitchen, her footsteps hurried. Mitch slammed his beer bottle onto the table, the sound making several patrons flinch. "You think you're some kinda hero?" he growled, rising to his feet. His towering frame cast a shadow over the room, his posture radiating aggression. Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her expression unreadable. "I don't think anything," she said simply. "But I won't stand by and let you hurt anyone." The room went silent again, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Mitch took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he sized her up. "You've got a real mouth on you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But let me tell you how this works. This is my turf. My rules. And you don't belong here." Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "Maybe," she said. "But bullies like you don't scare me." That single sentence was like a spark to dry kindling. Mitch's face turned a deep shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. "Bullies," he echoed, his voice rising. "You don't know who you're messing with." Behind him, one of his crew muttered, "Boss, maybe we should just..." "Shut up." Mitch snapped, his gaze never leaving Emily. Emily didn't so much as blink. Her calmness only seemed to enrage Mitch further. He took another step forward, now standing just inches from her. "You wanna play tough?" he sneered. "Let's see how tough you really are." Emily sighed softly, as if she'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. But in her mind, she was already 3 steps ahead, assessing Mitch's stance, his center of gravity, the tension in his muscles. She knew exactly what he was going to do before he even moved. Mitch swung a fist, aiming straight for her face. He never connected. In one fluid motion, Emily sidestepped and caught his wrist, twisting it just enough to force him off balance without causing permanent damage. She stepped forward, using his own momentum against him, and in the blink of an eye, Mitch was face down on the floor, his arm pinned behind his back. The room erupted into chaos. Mitch's crew surged to their feet, shouting and cursing, but none of them dared to make a move. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of shock and awe. Mitch struggled against her grip, his face pressed against the floor. "You're gonna pay for this," he snarled, his voice muffled. Emily leaned down slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Stop struggling. You'll only make it worse for yourself." "Let him go," one of the bikers shouted, his hand twitching toward the knife strapped to his belt. Emily's gaze snapped to him, her eyes narrowing. "Don't," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You don't want to escalate this." The biker hesitated, glancing at Mitch, who was still pinned to the ground and cursing under his breath. Scarface finally stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Okay, let's all take it down a notch," he said, his voice shaky. "No need for things to get out of hand." Emily held Mitch's arm for a moment longer, then released him and stepped back. Mitch scrambled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and fury. "You're dead," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You hear me? Dead." Emily didn't respond. She simply stood there, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, watching him carefully. Mitch stormed out of the barbecue joint, his crew trailing behind him. The sound of their motorcycles revving to life filled the air, followed by the roar of engines as they sped off into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly, the patrons began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The waitress emerged from the kitchen, her face pale but her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said again, her voice trembling. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Emily offered her a small smile. "They'll think twice before bothering you again," she said. The older man at the bar shook his head in amazement. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but that was the damnedest thing I've ever seen." Emily didn't respond. She picked up her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, she glanced up at the night sky, her expression thoughtful. She knew Mitch wouldn't let this go. Bullies like him never did. But Emily had faced worse threats before, and she wasn't about to back down now. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs, and walked toward her car. Somewhere out there, Mitch was already plotting his revenge. But Emily wasn't worried. She'd dealt with men like him before. And if he thought she was just a lone deer, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Emily's boots crunched against the gravel as she walked to her car. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and steady, but her mind was anything but idle. Mitch's threat hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and she knew better than to dismiss it. Men like him didn't forget humiliation, and they certainly didn't forgive it. Sliding into the driver's seat, she paused for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't rattled by the confrontation, her years of training had conditioned her against that, but she wasn't naive either. Mitch wasn't just a man nursing a bruised ego, he was a leader of a pack that thrived on intimidation and violence. Emily adjusted her rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of the barbecue joint behind her. Through the window, she could see the waitress speaking to the older man at the bar. The tension in the room had eased, but the shadows of fear lingered in their faces. It was clear this wasn't the first time Mitch and his crew had darkened their door, nor would it be the last if someone didn't stop them. She sighed, her fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. A part of her wanted to just drive away, to leave this town and its problems behind. After all, she was only passing through. But another part of her, the part that had guided her through years of service, through countless battles where she had fought to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, refused to let it go. Her decision was made before she even started the car. About 20 miles down the highway, Emily spotted the dim glow of headlights in her rearview mirror. Her suspicions had been correct. Mitch and his gang weren't going to let her leave without a fight. The motorcycles grew louder as they closed the distance, their engines roaring like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Emily's expression didn't change. If anything, there was a flicker of something almost resembling a smirk. "Amateurs," she muttered under her breath. She eased off the gas, letting the gap between her and the bikes shrink. The road was quiet and desolate, with nothing but fields stretching out on either side. The perfect place for an ambush. The first bike pulled up alongside her, the rider peering into her window with a smug grin. He made a crude gesture, laughing as he revved his engine. Emily glanced at him briefly, her face unreadable, before returning her focus to the road. A second bike appeared on her other side, its rider shouting something she couldn't hear over the roar of the engines. They were trying to box her in, to force her off the road. Big mistake. Emily flicked her blinker on a small, almost polite gesture before slamming on the brakes. The sudden move caught the bikers off guard. The one on her left swerved wildly, his bike skidding off the road and into the dirt. The rider on her right managed to stay upright but was forced to veer sharply to avoid a collision. Emily didn't waste any time. She shifted into reverse, her car roaring backward as she angled it across the road, blocking any escape. The remaining bikers came to a screeching halt, their tires skidding against the asphalt. Mitch was at the head of the group, his face twisted in a mix of rage and disbelief. Emily stepped out of the car, her movements deliberate as she left the engine running. The soft glow of her headlights illuminated her figure, casting long shadows across the road. For a moment, there was silence. The bikers stared at her, their bravado faltering as they registered the quiet confidence in her stance. "What's your game, lady?" Mitch growled, stepping off his bike. He cracked his knuckles, trying to reassert his dominance. "You think you're some kind of action hero?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but cold. "You followed me. I figured you wanted my attention." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Mitch, however, wasn't backing down. He took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "And you have no idea who I am." The tension snapped like a rubber band. One of the bikers lunged at her, his movements sloppy and uncoordinated, a man used to winning fights through sheer intimidation rather than skill. Emily moved like water. She sidestepped his attack with ease, her hand shooting out to grab his wrist. In one swift motion, she twisted, sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp of pain. Another biker charged at her from behind, but she was ready. She ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him with a precise kick. He hit the ground hard, groaning as he tried to catch his breath. Mitch's face contorted with fury. "Get her," he bellowed, and the remaining bikers hesitated only a moment before obeying. What followed was a whirlwind of movement, a blur of punches, kicks, and expertly executed maneuvers. Emily was outnumbered, but it didn't matter. Her training, her discipline, and her sheer presence were more than enough to tip the scales in her favor. One by one, the bikers fell, their confidence crumbling with each failed attempt to bring her down. Finally, it was just Mitch. He stood a few feet away, his chest heaving as he stared at her with a mixture of fear and rage. "You don't get it, do you?" he snarled, his voice shaking. "I run this town. You can't just waltz in and—" Emily cut him off, her voice steady and unyielding. "You don't run anything, Mitch. Not anymore." Her words were like a punch to the gut. Mitch's bravado crumbled, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Emily stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his. "Walk away," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Take your men and leave. If I ever hear about you harassing anyone again, we'll finish this. And I promise, you won't like how it ends." Mitch hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. But in the end, survival won. He spat on the ground, muttering a string of curses under his breath as he turned and stalked back to his bike. His crew, battered and bruised, followed suit, their heads hanging low. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving Emily alone on the empty road. She stood there for a moment, her breathing steady as she surveyed the scene. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Men like Mitch didn't give up easily. But for tonight, at least, the fight was won. Emily returned to her car, her expression unreadable as she slid back into the driver's seat. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Mitch and his crew were a symptom of a larger problem, one that wouldn't go away unless someone stood up to them. And if no one else was willing to do it, then she would. The room froze. Mitch's sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. His buddies exchanged wide-eyed glances, their bravado cracking under the weight of Emily's words. "Navy SEALs." One of them muttered, almost to himself. Emily stood motionless, her calm presence filling the room with an authority that didn't need yelling or threats. She didn't move to attack, but the way she carried herself, straight-backed, grounded, and absolutely sure of her strength, spoke louder than any punch could. Mitch's lip curled, though his bravado seemed more for show now. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had moments ago. Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching in the faintest hint of amusement. "You think so? Would you like me to demonstrate?" The cook, who had been hiding behind the counter, suddenly peeked out, his mouth agape. The waitress, still trembling, stared at Emily as though seeing her for the first time. One of Mitch's crew took a hesitant step back. Boss, maybe we should. Shut up. Mitch barked, his pride wounded. But Emily didn't let the moment pass. She advanced a single step, her gaze locked on Mitch. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the room like a blade. I've seen men twice your size and 10 times as dangerous crumble because they underestimated the wrong person. Do you want to be next? Mitch's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Emily continued, her tone steady and calm, as if she were lecturing a wayward recruit. I've trained for years to take down threats bigger and badder than you. You think you're untouchable because you've got numbers and a loud mouth. But let me tell you something, Mitch. All that posturing? It doesn't mean a thing when you're up against someone who knows how to really fight. The silence in the room deepened, the tension thick enough to slice. Mitch's chest heaved as he looked at her, weighing his options. He could see it now, the way she stood, the precision in her movements, the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. But he was too proud to back down completely. This isn't over, he said through gritted teeth. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression softening into something almost pitying. For your sake, Mitch, it should be. Her words carried the weight of a warning, a promise that needed no embellishment. The bikers shuffled out moments later, their swagger replaced by a sullen silence. Mitch was the last to leave, casting one final glare over his shoulder before slamming the door behind him. The barbecue joint seemed to exhale collectively once they were gone. The waitress slumped against the counter, her knees nearly giving out, while the cook emerged fully from the kitchen, his hands still clutching a frying pan as if it were a weapon. Emily picked up her fork and sat back down at her table, as though nothing had happened. The waitress hesitated, then approached cautiously. Are you, really a SEAL? Emily gave her a small nod. Retired, but yes. The waitress stared at her, then let out a shaky laugh. No wonder you weren't scared. Scared? Emily repeated, her tone light. Of what? A man who's all bark and no bite. She took a sip of her iced tea, glancing toward the door. Though I doubt we've seen the last of him. The waitress's face fell. You think they'll come back? Probably, Emily said honestly, setting her glass down. Men like Mitch don't take humiliation lightly. But if they do, I'll still be here. The waitress blinked. You'd stay. For us? Emily shrugged. Why not? It's not like I have anywhere urgent to be. The cook spoke up then, his voice rough with gratitude. I don't know what we'd have done without you tonight. Those guys have been terrorizing us for months. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression sharpening. 4 months. The waitress nodded. They show up every few weeks, drink too much, make threats, sometimes worse. Nobody's stood up to them before. Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind already working. She wasn't one to get involved in local dramas, but this wasn't just a drama. It was a pattern of abuse, and if nobody stopped it, it would only escalate. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. I'm going to need a little help, she murmured, scrolling through her contacts. The waitress tilted her head. Help? What kind of help? Emily gave her a reassuring smile. The kind that gets results. 2 days later, the Pitstop barbecue joint was unusually quiet. Mitch and his crew hadn't shown their faces, but Emily knew better than to assume the problem was solved. She'd spent the past 48 hours preparing. Calls had been made, a plan put in place. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, she waited in the parking lot, her posture relaxed but her senses on high alert. Sure enough, the rumble of motorcycles broke the stillness. The headlights appeared first, cutting through the dusk, followed by the deafening roar of engines. Emily stood, her arms crossed, as Mitch and his gang rolled in. They dismounted their bikes with a swagger that was more forced than usual, their eyes darting around nervously. Mitch stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "Back for more, huh?" he taunted. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gestured behind her, where a group of vehicles was pulling into the lot. They weren't just any vehicles, they were military grade. As the doors opened, several men and women stepped out, their movements precise and their faces unreadable. These weren't locals. They were Emily's people, friends and former teammates from her SEAL days, answering her call without hesitation. Mitch's confidence evaporated as the reality of the situation sank in. What is this?" he stammered. Emily stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This is your last chance, Mitch. You walk away now, for good, or you'll be dealing with more than just me." One of the SEALs, a towering man with arms like tree trunks, cracked his knuckles. "I'd take the lady's advice if I were you." Mitch looked around, his bravado crumbling. He could see it now, the precision, the discipline, the quiet danger in each of these people. They weren't bluffing. With a strangled growl, he turned to his crew. "Let's go." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled onto their bikes and roared out of the lot, leaving Mitch to follow in their wake. As the last bike disappeared into the night, the SEAL beside Emily chuckled. "Still cleaning up messes, huh, Dawson?" Emily smirked, her eyes glinting. "Some things never change." The group shared a quiet laugh, the tension easing. For now, at least, the fight was over. But as Emily turned back toward the barbecue joint, she knew this wasn't just about Mitch or his gang. It was about the people who lived in fear, who needed someone to show them they didn't have to stand alone. And if that someone had to be her, so be it. Mitch's retreat left behind a silence that felt heavier than the roaring engines that had filled the parking lot moments ago. The SEAL team fanned out instinctively, scanning the surroundings for any sign of a lingering threat. Emily watched them with a faint smile, appreciating the familiarity of their discipline and precision. It was like stepping back into an old rhythm, one that had saved her life countless times before. "Think they'll stay gone this time?" asked Daniels, the towering SEAL who had spoken earlier. He leaned casually against one of the trucks, but his sharp eyes betrayed his readiness for action. Emily crossed her arms, her expression thoughtful. "Hard to say. Guys like Mitch don't take well to losing face. They might lick their wounds for a while, but if they've been running this racket for months, it's not just about ego. There's money, power, or both at stake." Daniels nodded. "So, what's the move, boss?" Emily smirked at the old nickname. She hadn't been his commanding officer in years, but her team still fell back into the habit whenever they were around her. "For now, we wait. They'll either come back, or they'll find someone else to hassle. Either way, I'm not letting this slide." Inside the barbecue joint, the atmosphere was a mix of awe and relief. The cook, finally setting down his makeshift frying pan weapon, approached the group hesitantly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Emily waved him off. "No thanks needed. You've been through enough." The waitress, who had been silently watching from the corner, stepped forward. "Do you really think they'll come back?" Emily hesitated, not wanting to sugarcoat the situation. "Maybe. But I'm ready for them. And now, so are you." The waitress blinked, confused. "Us?" Emily leaned against the counter, her gaze steady. Mitch's type thrives on fear. The more people shrink back, the bolder they get. But if they face resistance, if they know there's a community willing to stand up to them, they'll think twice. You don't need to be Navy SEALs to protect your own. The waitress frowned, doubt clouding her face. "But we're not like you." We're just normal people. Normal people are capable of extraordinary things, Emily said firmly. You don't have to fight like I do. Sometimes, standing together and saying no is enough. Her words hung in the air, resonating with the small crowd that had gathered. The cook straightened slightly, a spark of determination in his eyes. The following days saw a transformation in the small barbecue joint. Emily stayed true to her word, using her time and resources to prepare the locals for whatever might come next. She started with simple drills, teaching the staff and regulars basic self-defense techniques. Daniels and a few of the other SEALs joined in, their presence both reassuring and inspiring. The cook, initially skeptical, proved surprisingly quick to pick up new skills. The waitress, still nervous but eager to learn, practiced with a quiet determination that reminded Emily of her younger self. Word of what was happening spread quickly. More locals began to show up not just to eat, but to join the impromptu training sessions. Farmers, mechanics, and even the town's retired schoolteacher took turns learning how to defend themselves. You've started something here, Daniels remarked one evening, as the group wrapped up a session. Emily glanced at the growing crowd and nodded. They've started it? I'm just giving them a push. It didn't take long for Mitch to hear about the changes. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the idea of his former victims banding together infuriated him. They think they can fight us, he growled, slamming a beer bottle onto the table in his dingy hideout. That little Navy brat thinks she can waltz in and turn them into heroes. His crew shuffled uncomfortably. They had seen firsthand what Emily was capable of, and the idea of going up against her again didn't sit well with them. We don't have to fight them head-on, one of the bikers suggested cautiously. We could hit M where it hurts. Scare M into submission. Mitch's eyes narrowed as he considered the idea. If they want to play hero, let's give them a reason to regret it. The attack came at night. Emily was on watch outside the barbecue joint, a thermos of coffee in hand, when she heard the faint rumble of engines in the distance. She didn't panic, her training wouldn't allow it. Instead, she moved swiftly, alerting the team inside and taking her position near the entrance. The lights of the motorcycles grew brighter as they approached, splitting into two groups that circled the parking lot like predators closing in on prey. Mitch was at the front, his face twisted into a triumphant sneer. Thought you'd seen the last of me, huh? He called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the engines. Emily didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her stance calm and unshaken. You made a mistake coming back, Mitch. Behind her, the locals emerged from the building. They weren't SEALs, and they weren't armed, but they stood together, shoulders squared and heads held high. Mitch barked a laugh. What's this? Your little army of farmers and waitresses? You really think they can stop us? Emily's voice was steady as she replied. They don't have to. I will. With that, the tension snapped. Mitch's crew roared forward, but Emily was ready. She moved like a shadow, her precise strikes taking down one biker after another. Daniels and the other SEALs joined the fray, their presence tipping the scales heavily in favor of the defenders. The locals didn't fight, but they stood firm, refusing to scatter or retreat. Their unity was a wall Mitch's crew couldn't break, and it rattled them more than any punch could. As the battle raged on, it became clear that Mitch had underestimated Emily and the strength of a community that refused to be bullied. When it was over, the parking lot was eerily quiet. Mitch lay sprawled on the ground, groaning in pain, while his remaining crew limped away, dragging their wounded with them. Emily stood over Mitch, her expression unreadable. This is over, she said, her voice low but firm. If I see you or your crew here again, I won't be this nice. Mitch glared up at her, his pride in tatters. He opened his mouth to argue, but one look at her steely gaze made him think better of it. He staggered to his feet and climbed onto his bike, muttering curses under his breath as he rode away. The locals erupted into cheers, their fear replaced by a newfound confidence. They weren't Navy SEALs, but they had stood their ground, and that was a victory in itself. Emily smiled as she watched them celebrate, a quiet pride swelling in her chest. She didn't need to say anything, their actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The next morning, as the sun rose over the barbecue joint, the waitress approached Emily with a shy smile. "Are you leaving now?" she asked. Emily nodded. "You don't need me anymore. You've got this." The waitress hesitated, then hugged her tightly. "Thank you. For everything." Emily returned the hug briefly before stepping back. "Just remember, strength isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about standing together, no matter what." With that, she climbed into her truck and drove off, leaving behind a town that would never be the same. The door to the barbecue joint swung shut behind Mitch and his crew with a thud that echoed through the room. The hum of the jukebox started up again, a broken tune floating through the air as if nothing had just happened. But everything had changed. The cook walked over, wiping his hands on his apron. "I don't know what we would have done without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at the floor, then back at Emily. "We've been living in fear, letting those guys push us around for months. Now we don't have to." "I don't know what to say." Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. "You don't need to say anything. Just keep standing up for yourself. That's all it takes." The waitress, still catching her breath, shuffled closer. "I didn't think anyone could stop them," she said, her eyes wide with awe. "But you," she paused, shaking her head. "How did you do that?" Emily shrugged, her movements casual despite the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins. "Training. And a little bit of luck." She didn't mention how close Mitch had come to getting the upper hand, how that last fight had tested her patience and control more than she cared to admit. Instead, she focused on the people around her, the faces of those who had dared to step up, who had held their ground despite everything. The waitress didn't seem to notice the quiet shift in Emily's demeanor, her voice full of admiration. "You were incredible. Like a superhero." She laughed nervously. "But, with real skills." Emily chuckled softly. "Not a superhero. Just someone who's been trained to handle situations like this." The cook nodded, his expression serious now. "You've done something for us today. Not just stopped them, but you've shown us that we can stand up for ourselves too. That's worth more than anything." The words hit harder than Emily expected. She wasn't used to being looked at like this, like a savior. It was a feeling she had put behind her after leaving the Navy. In the military, she was always part of a team, a collective force, but out here in the civilian world, she was just one person. The weight of that responsibility was something she hadn't anticipated, and for a moment, it made her uneasy. But she didn't let it show. "It's not about me. It's about you guys. This place, your community. You all have the power to make sure this doesn't happen again. Don't let fear control you." Her words felt true, but they also felt like a challenge. She wasn't here to take control of this town, to be their protector indefinitely. She had her own life to get back to. She wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore, but she needed to try. The road ahead was unclear, but Emily had always known how to adapt, to find her way, no matter the odds. The waitress smiled, her posture straighter now. "You're right. We've been afraid for too long. It's time we stopped letting people like Mitch walk all over us." Emily nodded, impressed by the resolve in the waitress's voice. "Exactly." The cook clapped his hands together, a loud sound that seemed to shake off the last remnants of tension in the room. "All right. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us. But first, how about we get this lady something to eat?" He grinned, his rough features softening with a hint of humor. "You can't save a whole town on an empty stomach." Emily looked down at her half-eaten plate and then back at him. She hadn't even realized how hungry she was until he mentioned it. "I think I could go for some more ribs," she said with a small grin. As the night wore on, the mood in the barbecue joint shifted from one of anxiety to one of quiet triumph. People spoke in low voices, exchanging stories about how they had been affected by Mitch and his gang. Some had been afraid to speak up before, but now, their voices were rising in unison, as if the walls that had kept them silent for so long were finally coming down. Emily sat at the counter, listening more than talking. She had no desire to be the center of attention, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The way the people were rallying together, their confidence building piece by piece, gave her hope. It was the same feeling she had gotten in the Navy when she saw a team finally pulling together, working as one unit. That's what made a difference. After a while, the cook came over and slid a full plate of ribs in front of Emily, along with a cold drink. "Compliments of the house," he said with a wink. "You're gonna need your strength. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Emily grinned and dug in. It had been a long time since she'd felt like she could just relax and enjoy something simple. And in that moment, surrounded by the people she had helped, she finally felt a weight lift from her shoulders. As the evening grew late, Emily finished her meal and stood up, stretching her arms above her head. She had planned to leave earlier, but the sense of camaraderie here had kept her longer than she expected. It wasn't often that she felt connected to a community, but tonight, something had shifted. She turned to face the group one last time. The waitress was chatting with the cook, their conversation punctuated by laughter. A few of the other regulars who had been too shy to speak earlier were now exchanging stories and ideas for how they could protect themselves in the future. Some were even considering starting a neighborhood watch. Emily smiled to herself, proud of them. "All right, guys. It's time for me to go." The waitress looked up, surprised. "You're leaving?" Emily nodded. "Yeah. I've done what I can here. But you all are going to be fine. I have no doubt." The cook shook his head. "You don't have to go. We've got a lot more to talk about." She smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "I know. But you're ready now. You're not going to need me around. You've got this. Keep building on what you've started." She walked toward the door, pausing as she reached for the handle. "You're always welcome back here, you know," the cook called out. Emily looked back over her shoulder and gave him a small nod. "Thanks. Maybe one day." As she stepped outside into the cool night air, the sound of the barbecue joint's lively chatter faded behind her. She glanced at her truck parked under the glow of the streetlights and made her way toward it, a sense of closure settling over her. It had been a long time since she'd felt like she made a difference. But here, tonight, she had. She didn't need to stay to prove that. The people inside were stronger than they had been when she first arrived, and they would keep fighting for their home, for their dignity. That was enough. As she started the engine and drove away, the quiet hum of the road ahead felt right. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, Emily knew she was heading in the right direction. As Emily stood outside, the cool evening breeze brushed her face, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and grilled meat from the barbecue joint. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the parking lot, turning the sky a deep orange. It was a peaceful, almost surreal moment, especially after the chaos that had just unfolded inside. For a moment, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She'd been on the road for so long, always moving from one place to the next, never truly staying anywhere. It was a habit formed by necessity, by the need to keep her distance, to never settle for too long. But tonight had been different. Tonight, she had stayed, she had stepped in when the community needed someone, and she had made a difference. She turned back to look at the barbecue joint one last time. The sounds of laughter and voices from inside, now filled with relief and confidence, floated out into the cool air. For the first time, it felt like those people, those strangers, had begun to stand tall, to find their strength. Mitch and his gang had always been bullies, believing they could dominate with fear and intimidation. They thought that by making others small, they could be big. But they had forgotten one simple truth that had been proven to them tonight. Not everyone is what they seem. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room was the one they should fear the most. The ones who sat back, who observed, who bided their time, waiting for the right moment. Mitch had mistaken Emily for a weak, easy target. He had underestimated her because she didn't fit his idea of strength. She wasn't loud. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The power that lay within her was silent, calculated, and deep-rooted in the years of discipline, training, and experiences she had carried with her. And tonight, it had been enough. She wasn't some flashy hero, rushing into the spotlight to prove herself. She wasn't someone who sought out conflict or craved recognition. She was simply someone who had been given the tools to protect, to serve, and when necessary, to stand up. But more than that, she had learned that true strength wasn't about fighting, it was about knowing when to act, when to step back, and when to let others rise to the occasion. The people inside, the waitress, the cook, the regulars who had watched in silence for so long, had seen her step forward not as a hero, but as someone who had taken their fear away. And they had learned something valuable: they didn't need to rely on others to fix their problems. They could stand up for themselves, and in the process, they could rebuild what Mitch and his crew had tried to tear down. Emily's fingers brushed against the cool metal of her truck, but she didn't get in right away. She stood there for a few more seconds, reflecting. She thought about the countless times she had kept moving, kept pushing forward without looking back. It had always been easier to leave things behind, to not get attached, to not care too deeply. But tonight had made her realize something she hadn't fully acknowledged before: maybe there was more to life than just moving forward. She had spent so much time focusing on herself, her mission, her duty, that she had forgotten the value of connecting with others. She'd built walls around herself, trying to shield the vulnerability that came with relationships, with community. But tonight, she had seen something shift in those people: the waitress, the cook, the quiet customers. They had found their voice, found their courage. And though she had left them with the tools to defend themselves, it was they who had built their own strength. Maybe that was what mattered most: not what you could do for others, but what you could inspire in them. Not everyone needed saving. Sometimes, all people needed was a reminder of their own power. And tonight, that was what Emily had done. She had reminded them that they were stronger than they thought, that they could face their fears, that they could take control of their lives. As she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, a quiet calm settled over her. She wasn't going back to a life of running. Not anymore. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew it would be different. Maybe she wouldn't always have the answers, maybe she wouldn't always have the right words. But she had learned that the quietest moments often held the most power. The road stretched out before her, the headlights cutting through the darkness, a long journey ahead. But for once, Emily wasn't running. She was simply moving forward, knowing that she had made a difference, even if it was in a small town, in a quiet moment. And that was enough. In life, there were no guarantees, no perfect paths. But the key was to keep going, to keep standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. It wasn't always about winning or losing. It was about doing what you knew was necessary, even when no one was watching. And in the end, that would make all the difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the world turned dark around her, Emily felt a sense of peace settle into her heart. There would always be challenges ahead, always moments of uncertainty. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She knew who she was, and she knew that the quietest person in the room could often be the one to change everything. And sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones we fought within ourselves. But those were the battles that truly shaped us. The road ahead might be long, but Emily knew she would walk it with purpose, with strength, and with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've done what needed to be done. And in that, there was a kind of power that no one could ever take away. The journey wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for tonight, as the stars began to fill the sky, Emily allowed herself to believe in the quiet victories. Because sometimes, it wasn't the loudest victories that mattered most. It was the small, quiet moments that would stick with you long after the noise faded away. And that was enough.